Good morning. Thank you for letting me be with you guys. I know there's a whole bunch of experience in this room. I understand many of you have been in different ministries and the ministry that you're currently in. And I really find it an honor just to get to spend some time with you. I want you to know this course is going to be interactive, but on a time frame. So I'm a little bit crunched on how much time, because I am a pastor, I can talk forever. And so when you say an hour and a half, I go, oh, that's not enough time. So we will have some chances for you to do some breakout sessions and talk a little bit too. And then we'll be interactive, but please don't be offended if I shut down some of the conversation as I'm looking at the notes going, okay, I'm running out of time. So please do ask questions, please do field them. Stay on this topic though, if we could at this time. And then we'll go from there, but if I cut you short, please don't be offended. All right, here's what I want you to do. As we start this course, what we're going to talk about is expanding maybe your horizons in chaplaincy. And maybe some of you are saying, well, I don't want to expand it. That's all right. I'm hopefully going to teach you how to create some bridges instead of walls between others who do trauma-related work, and how we can do that. That's one of the things that we really focus on at Responders Resource Center, is creating bridges between 911 chaplains and hospital chaplains, between school districts and the way they deal with kids in trauma and crisis, and the 911 chaplains and the hospital chaplain. And then how we add in hospice chaplains and other different groups of chaplains. And so even if you say, I'm not going to expand my level of care. Are you kidding? I'm so busy I can hardly sleep. That's all right. What I'm hoping to do is help you figure out how to partner with some of those around you who do similar work but in a different capacity. Fair enough? Okay, so this is what I want you to do. We're going to break up real quickly. And see, I just got you together and we're already interactive. I told you, I promised, it's good. You're going to break up in groups of 3, and here's what I want you to discuss. Does everybody have a copy of the notes? Yeah, okay, good. You're going to break up, and I want you to discuss if there's ever been another type of chaplaincy that you've done or that you've been interested in doing. And 5 minutes goes pretty fast. So what I'm going to ask is that no one person dominates the conversation. No one person preaches at everybody else and tells them their life story. That's not what we're looking for here. 5 minutes is fast. So briefly, if you have done another type of chaplaincy, take your minute and a quarter. So with COVID and with some of the changes that have happened to us culturally and internationally, truly, what I understand is that chaplain teams have had to evolve. They have had to start to look at different ways to interact with their community. And I really believe that chaplaincy is the evangelism of the 21st century, especially in our nation. I believe it. Now, it doesn't mean we're going out and we're, just trying to share the gospel with every single person, but we are the presence and the fragrance and the aroma of the Lord in the places we go. And they know we represent them. They know that when we walk in, Jesus is in the room. He's come with us because the Holy Spirit lives inside of us. So we know that, right? But what I will say is that the teams are having to evolve and they're having to change. I had a CISM team that I personally lead that was about 33 people strong. After COVID, we were at 6. So as people started emerging again and starting to find places that they could plug back in, we went from about 33 to 6. I think I'm at about 12 to 14 depending on the month now. And so I know that probably doors that were open to you before were shut for at least a period of time. And then when those doors opened up, the background, the dynamics, the relationships, the freedom to move in certain places actually changed. We see a lot of these stories even in military chaplains. We've seen this in a few hospital settings, even recently, military hospitals, VAs, where you've had groups who have a faith-based background who have been uninvited. They've been told, no, you're no longer welcome in this place. So what might have happened is that your role as a chaplain could have been diminished, your contacts with people. Some of you might be, no, it was the exact opposite. I'm busier than ever because for those 33 people you have, the majority of them quit. I'm filling all their hours. I get that too. I do understand. So we really could be talking both ends of the spectrum, which again, I think this topic today will help with, because part of it is how do we make strategic partners in people who do what we do, but in a different venue. maybe to a different group of people or called out in a different setting. We're going to come back to that, but I want you to think about that. Some people, even who were doing the work that you're doing, they might have stepped out of this role because of the stressors that the last 3 or 4 years have caused to them personally. Changes in their own life, changes in their own health care, changes in their own ability to manage personal traumas. And so the question is, how do we continue to expand? If this really is the evangelism of the 21st century in America, which I believe it is, then how do we capitalize on what's happened instead of pull back or retreat? And so hopefully this course will bring some of those questions up and make you think about them a little bit more, and maybe even be a little bit more intentional about moving past thinking to action. And that's where I want to get you. So my organization, as Nancy mentioned, is Responders Resource Center. Planted it about 9 or 10 years ago, but I actually started the work of it years before that. And we train all types of chaplains. So here's some things to consider in chaplaincy, but not limited to chaplaincy in these groups. We train hospitals. So I train all of Kaiser Permanente on the West Coast in their CISM training. I train a ton of other hospital teams from around the country, police departments. We go to them, they come to us. We do a combination of both. They're probably my biggest customer. Fire, churches. We train a lot of churches now. Churches are getting very involved in trauma intervention. So our team responds, our Southwest Washington CISM team responds to churches when they have a major disaster. And what I frequently hear from the senior pastors when we're called in is, hey, I'm a senior pastor, but I'm not trained for this. And what that should tell us is that there's an acknowledgement, even from senior pastors inside of the churches, that they've been given a spiritual gifting. They certainly have their job, but are they trained to do large-scale trauma intervention? I'm going to tell you the vast majority are not. They do not know how to do that. So I respond to a lot of churches. Churches where a teen in the church will suicide. We responded to a church, and we use this as a case study in our 4th course of a youth group that went out, and they were having a week-long camp, and they ended up along the Columbia River in one of the tributaries, and they walked out in the knee-deep water because there was other people out there. The other group came in. They were still out there. They decided to come in about a half hour later. They didn't know that the dam had decided that they had to spill. So they spilled a bunch, and as they were walking back in knee-deep water, and those tributaries are calm, but the Columbia River, it's raging. Well, all of a sudden, that water came rushing down and washed the sandbar out from underneath them, and the youth pastor and a 10-year-old boy drowned in the process. So the church calls and says, hey, we need you. Can you come to us? And so that's the kind of stuff that our team will do also. We go to churches, and I want you to tuck that away in your own mind as another place that you might consider reaching out to. And then we go and we help them figure out how to process the trauma in all the different groups. And again, the last course tomorrow, we'll actually process some of that. We'll walk through what that looks like and how to set up a large-scale response like that. We train nursing home chaplains. I've had the privilege of training biker chaplains. We have Bikers for Christ in our area. I don't know if you have them here. I think they're a national club. And we train the chaplains, and boy, they're a hoot. I mean, they're fun. They go into places that you and I wouldn't go into. You know, they're the Sons of Anarchy, and they'll ask them to come in there and do a memorial for one of their members who died on a ride or something. And they come in and they preach the gospel to guys who are selling heroin. And they have an open door, an open and effectual door for preaching the gospel, because they do. They go in and they do those memorials, and they meet with the families, and they preach the love of Jesus to people that they would never be able to touch apart from being a biker who's a chaplain. So biker chaplains, we've trained quite a few of those. Sports clubs, and you do know that most sports teams, professional sports teams, have chaplains. So I used to be a women's international gymnastics coach, and during that time of my life, I was not a follower of Jesus, and a couple of my gymnasts had become blazer dancers for the Trailblazer team, and they were wild kids, and I knew it. But the chaplain on the blazer team led them to Jesus. About the same time the Lord was leading me to Jesus. And years later, we got to connect again through Facebook and realize that they're followers of Jesus, like active out there, missionary working in the field. So sports chaplains, and I would pose this question: why don't we have chaplains in minor team sports? Why don't we have them? They're needed. I can tell you as an international coach in a local club, I had one of two incidents I can think of very prominently. I had a gymnast whose best friend was killed by her dad accidentally when he was falling a tree. And he fell a tree and the tree crushed her to death. And I remember being the coach, and I came into the gym and I had an opportunity to minister, but I didn't know the Lord. I didn't know how to do any of those things, so I did the secular understanding to the best of my knowledge. I had another gymnast whose dad was very prominent in the team. You know, you raise the kids from they're 5 until they go off to college or whatever they're going to do. And her dad was out jogging, had a heart attack, and died. And boy, I sure wished I'd had a bunch of the skills that I have now then. But those teams around you, soccer clubs, gymnastics teams, track teams, there's a lot of clubs that are not school related. As a matter of fact, your highest level athletes are not in the school system in sports typically. They're in private clubs, private soccer clubs, volleyball clubs, track clubs, gymnastics clubs, wrestling clubs. Find those groups and go in and say, hey, look, we know that when trauma happens, here's the language, it reduces performance and causes some of the kids to quit. Right? When you talk to a corporation, talk about money. When you're talking to coaches, talk about loss of athletes and loss of performance and say, our group would love to come in and be here for you when a trauma hits, a divorce in the family, a death of somebody, an athlete gets injured really bad, and you see that there might be some mental blocks. Doors start opening and the gospel goes out because God's people come in. And I would say missionary organizations. So I think I met Nancy and Chuck and Peggy through Mission Connection, which is the largest Northwest mission organization. It's a conference once a year, and I typically teach 3 to 4 trauma courses during that time. And so I'm teaching missionaries, and I'll tell you what, here's something we've learned with missionaries. They experience a lot of trauma in many places. And if you want an open door, teach missionaries how to give death notifications and have them go to the magistrates or the local government and tell them, hey, I realize this is a hard job. You already have a hard job. We would be honored to be able to help you when somebody dies to come and help the family or even give the notification. And immediately, you start making some really close connections with people on a really intimate level. So again, where can this go? Where can the training that you already have go? I do a lot of missions work. I was a mission pastor for a period of time. I've been on a lot of missions over the last 29 years all over the world. Been to places to train people in trauma. We've just recently been invited to go to Ukraine and train Fellowship of Christian Athletes to teach the coaches how to go in and deal with trauma. So I think in August we're going into Ukraine, August or September, into a war zone, and we're going to take a team of 3 and we're going to teach them how to deal with trauma, how to deal with death and grieving.
That's awesome.
I've been to Beirut, Lebanon, and dealt with the Syrian war refugees coming across the border, teaching Youth for Christ volunteers, 29 Youth for Christ volunteers, how to do trauma intervention and how to help people through crisis. And who you're talking to? Predominantly Muslim people coming across that border. Now we got some Christians in there too, but think about that. Missions organizations, where can this go? Every mission team that I take out, on the last day while we're there, before we pack up and come home the next morning, we do a CISD, a critical incident stress debriefing, that I've modified for mission teams. And we go through, because you know so many of the mission teams, especially first timers, they go out even for a short-term mission and they come back. But that's a lot to process.
Yes,
If they've never seen it, they don't know what to do with it. It's a lot to process. So we process as a group and put the group together to support the group so that as they move forward, they're going to continue in missions and not become wounded and get waylaid off into the side. So think about your training there. Where are you already plugged in that you can take the skill sets that you have and say, well, I can use that in my church. I could even use that with a mission team, local or international or outreaching. And I want you to think about that, because I think there's a huge role for chaplains inside of the church and inside of missions organizations. And I think we kind of missed a giant opportunity when we have people who actually are experts like yourselves in this room, who can then go to them and say, look, I'd really like to be able to help our mission team when they come back in and get them going. So a couple places that I serve in that might be helpful to you, just to see that I really do like diversity of using chaplaincy. Again, I am the senior pastor of a church, really enjoy that. Got to plant a church, that was quite an experience. I get to see God show up in a lot of ways. I'm the clinical director for Southwest Washington CISM team, and that team, where we respond through there alone, I want you to know we have a pretty big outreach in just a community-based team. We're not part of a police department, fire department, hospital. We are our own team from our own organization. You could do it through HCMA if that's what you guys decide to do, and create teams that do trauma response outside of just the hospital setting, which I know many of you are like, I don't have time to do that, but just think about it, consider it. Who knows what God has for you? And what I will tell you is that team alone responds to a host of different groups of people, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, but I just want you to think about all the different places you might be able to reach on a temporary, short-term helping basis, okay? And we'll come back to that also. So again, I really am wanting to get you to think about things maybe you thought about before but quit thinking about, or bring you into some different thinking other than where you're focused, because we can get really myopic in our own ministry. And please excuse me if this comes across wrong. I don't know how to say this well, maybe I need to learn to say it, but I'll just say it and hear my heart. When we become myopic, we become elitist. And what we see is there's a lot of walls and not a lot of bridges between other trauma teams and chaplaincy organizations. Myopic becomes elitist. It's us. We're the best of the best. Nobody else should be able to touch the people we care for. There should be no transitions and handoffs and carryover. And I'm going to tell you, that hurts a lot of people. Right. It might not hurt us, we protect our territory, but it hurts a lot of people who could really benefit from chaplains and trauma teams playing well together and realizing where they work well. What's your field, and what are the areas that aren't your field? Well, who fills the gap when you're not allowed into the places that you don't currently serve? So I want to give you a little background about how our chaplaincy program came about. Again, not because you need to know anything about our chaplaincy program, but I think it might help you understand or think about or stimulate some thought into what you might want to do. While I was working as a care team pastor of a larger church, we had about 3,000 people. And if you've worked in the ministry setting, I know many of you have, of those, that church size setting, there were 7 of us as pastors. I served as a care team pastor. And what you realize is very quickly, if you actually have an evangelistic heart, which I imagine you do, that's why you're here, a church of 3,000 means you're probably caring for about 7,000 to 12,000. Because they all have family and co-workers and friends who are saved and go to different churches, or have fallen away or backslidden, pulled into the parking lot of faith and are an idol, or who just don't know Jesus. And what I found is that when you're in the position of caring for people in the church, not just talking at them, but talking to them and listening, what you'll find is all of a sudden people will say, hey, I have a coworker and she just found out she has breast cancer. Can you help? Hey, my daughter in this part of the country she just lost her son, my grandson. How can you help? And so we can see that they're actually a bridge to more people. Right. They're a bridge to people outside the faith. And they want you to go into those places, because how many people are equipped to do trauma? I always say it this way when I show up into a scene. I'm like, hey, we're here to help, and I want to help you talk about grief and trauma and those things, but I want you to understand, me and my team, we're weird. We sit around, we talk about death, dying, murder, suicide, rape, killing. And I realize that this isn't common for you, but it is common for us. And we do want to be able to have these conversations with you. But what you might be feeling in helplessness, like you don't know how to do these things, is because you're not weird like us.
Your topics probably are more about, going out and playing golf, and growing vegetables, and, what was the latest episode of your show and stuff. So let us come in and do that, but do think about that. When you are in a group of people, that group of people is who you serve, but they're also a bridge to people outside. And if they know that you're a listener and a carer, which you are, that's why you're here. Otherwise you wouldn't be here unless you're just trying to run away from the Pacific Northwest where it's rained nonstop for 6 months. And so that's what I started to experience in this church. I'm like, oh my gosh, we had 2 counseling pastors, myself being one, and a mentor pastor of mine had been around for a long time. And what I realized is we lost every single day. And what I mean by that is we always just had to put out the hottest fire. We could never get to the point of really caring for people deeply in trauma and sticking with them for a long enough period of time. So I looked, and what I saw is we have a prayer team and we had a care team. And I started to look into the prayer team and the care team as I got hired into this position. They were created before I was there. So I got them all together and I said, hey, let's do a care team dinner. That was my prime group. And I was told I had 60 people, 4 groups of 15, that each took a week. And so I sat down with them and I began to talk with them, and I wanted to figure out how they were doing, what training had they had, and how was it going. And so as I sat down with this group of people, I'm going to say about 35, 40 showed up. The other weren't there, how meetings are. And here's what I heard from the team. They put us in positions over our training. I was in over my head. I went in and I was told I was going in to help with this, and pretty soon I realized I was traumatized by the event. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the tools. Don't ever call me again. I came to this meeting to tell you I'm quitting. And so that stimulated a question, well, what kind of training had you had? And there was some training, but it wasn't real in-depth. 1 or 2 day trainings. And you can go to a 2-day training and become a senior chaplain in the United States in certain places now. I'd advise not doing that. Well, this team had a very minimal amount of training, and so they were put into situations that were over their head. Care team members were often traumatized and served short terms. So when traumatized, they're not going to continue. So what I realized too is we have a local outreach that actually reaches all the way from California back to Washington. And it's volunteers and organizations that work with 911 to be the ministry of presence, typically on a secular side, okay? So they're called to come when a death notification is given, or to sit with people, or just to be present. And I serve and see them quite often in some of the call-outs that we go to, especially in the school setting, and I'll come back to that one. And what I've noticed is that I see the same 4 or 5 people who really have some training somewhere else who are part of that team. But the rest of them are 6 to 9 months. That's how long they make it. They do a training, they're called out, 6 to 9 months later they'll retire from trauma intervention type of work. First of all, because they just simply don't have enough training. And they have no theology of suffering themselves. How do you deal with suffering if you don't have a theology of suffering? Which, by the way, is the greatest way to preach the gospel to police and fire departments and hospitals. Theology of suffering, right? They know you're a chaplain, you can work through that. So that would be one of them, and we just saw that wasn't working. Sometimes what I heard from them was well-meaning care members did more harm than good due to lack of skills and understanding. And you and I have all seen that. I hope everybody here knows the inverse bell curve model. So when you're having a trauma conversation, you need to start out in the cognitive. You ask some basic questions, you're making a connection. And then depending on the amount of time you have, you're going to allow yourself to move down into the affective zone where deeper emotional pieces reside. But you have to come back up into the cognitive zone to finish a trauma conversation. And what we saw was that just even the basic simple pieces of trauma conversations, like the inverse bell curve, didn't exist. And some of the ministries that other churches put off on how to deal with trauma and stuff, they don't have those concepts. They have great hearts, but they miss that concept. And so what they'll do is they'll start to have a trauma conversation with somebody, and they go right for the gut. Right for the hardest, deepest, darkest part. They don't create a rapport. They don't let that sub slowly sink into the water. They give them the bends right off the back. They take the sub and they drop it right to the bottom of the sea, and people implode. And then when they're done, it's kind of like surgery. They open them up, but they didn't take the time to close them. They didn't bring them back up to the cognitive. And so what we saw is people who had a really good heart and really loved people. I mean, really loved them, truly compassionately cared, but had no skill set for that, and they would do more harm than good. Oh, what you really need to do is cry. You just really need to, well, what if you're an instrumental griever and not an intuitive griever? And so we had people trying to get people just to have strong emotional experiences, believing that somehow that would help them. And what we realized is even in our own care team, we were pretty bad at that. We didn't have the basic understandings. And so I would say what happened was, as I looked around the team, I just realized they didn't have what was required of them to do the job that we assigned them as the church, so we set them up to be a victim. And I just want to ask you, in your own church settings where you're heavily involved, what does your prayer team use? When somebody comes up to the front of the prayer team and says, I just found out my husband's been unfaithful to me, and I don't know where I'm going with this, what is your prayer team use? I mean, let's pray. Oh, God of heaven, you have the answer. You know your words. But how should that conversation go? What should be the dynamics of that conversation? What should be the follow-up? What's the course of action now to help them? And what we find is a lot of times we say, you're it, and now get to the work. But we don't give any tools. And so you are holders of tools. You have tools in trauma intervention. Where can you place those other than just the setting that you're currently in? Where can you pass off some of those tools and hand them to some other people? Pretty important. And the final one that we saw that created some issues when I was looking at our group was due to the lack of training and expanding of their own interest and experience in trauma and grief, they tended to talk to people about their trauma more than the person's trauma, or they assumed, since they had been through a traumatic situation or a few, that everybody dealt with trauma the way they did, or grief, or loss, or suffering. And so what they do is they simply share their own story, believing that somehow that's going to help somebody else. And I'm not going to negate that, but it certainly shouldn't be the tools that we put out in the front. And they would often just believe that everybody must, therefore, experience trauma the same. So if they just explained and walked through trauma how they had to walk through it, which often is very dysfunctional without a guide, then that would be a help. So this is what I noticed in our team, and as you can imagine, I scratched my head and said, okay, we're in trouble. We've got to do something different, and we have to be more intensive about this. So trying to solve the problem, I looked into a bunch of different programs. Chaplaincy programs from different faith-based organizations, trauma programs through different agencies and departments. We just looked through everything that was out there, and I really went through a bunch of them. I got a ton of training in a very short period of time because I was trying to just take in everything we possibly could. And what I realized is that so many of them didn't deal with the issues that I dealt with inside of the church as a counseling pastor day to day. I mean, my office appointments are just full, nonstop, right? All day long. 3,000 people plus the sphere beyond, because we did open the door to the sphere beyond. We wanted to reach out to people. And so what are the issues that I deal with in the church? Well, sexual abuse. 1 in 3 girls before she is 18 will be sexually abused in this nation. 1 in 3. And boys are 1 in 4, and we believe they're underreported. So you could probably say that they're pretty similar. So look around your church body, look around the organizations that you're at, and realize that 1 in 3 will be sexually assaulted or raped before they're 18. We have a sex problem in our nation, right? Where do we as chaplains fit into that? Because I might show up for somebody's death notification, but what I realize is that the person who had been molesting them just died. Now, how's that going to impact the way that I'm going to now minister to this family? Because it's different. That dynamic is a significant dynamic. It's a big piece of the puzzle board, right? Male and female, the problem is here. And when we come to domestic violence, the other one, the statistics aren't far from that. It's about 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, depending on the agencies you listen to, will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. So how does that impact the way that we're dealing with it? Or how about mental health issues? And I realize as chaplains, especially in the settings that you're in, you're probably more adept to that than a 911 chaplain is. A 911 chaplain probably doesn't play a lot with bipolar 1, bipolar 2. They probably don't play a lot with seasonal affective disorder, postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis. That's just not their part. They're a ministry of presence, but you know that, and you're a good resource for them. Make the bridge. Make the bridge, right? So mental health is another piece that a lot of people really just don't understand. And where did they get their education? TV, which is wrong most of the time, right? And so they're experts because they saw it on YouTube. And then helping children process and recover from trauma and grief. That's another thing I deal with all the time as a counseling pastor. And what's really interesting to me is if you go to chaplaincy groups across the country, and I've trained a lot of groups now, when I talk to them, I say, how important do you think children are in the chaplaincy sphere? And they're like, they're the top of the list. And then I ask this question, how many of you work with children in trauma situations? And out of the 911 chaplain agencies, I found 0. Not one, hear me on this, not 1, not 2, 0. They don't even have training in how to deal and respond with children at developmental stages. And we're going to go through that in this course. I think it's our 3rd course. We're going to talk about dealing with children in trauma. So we identify that children are one of the sets of victims of difficulties or tragedies or experiencer of it. And the question is are we equipped as chaplains, or do we take the equipping we have and actually take the time to focus on children? And we're going to spend some time on that one, because I think it's a really important one, and there's so much that can be done. What are the other things that we deal with? Conflict resolution, and I think all of us have dealt with that. We did one in a hospital. This was an interesting one. I was called, and I was pastor of the previous church I was at. A young man had come there. He's still pretty rough around the edges, but he's 20-something. And Dad wakes up. By the way, I'm going to share some trauma stories. Is anybody not okay with that? I'll warn you every time I'm going to share a trauma story. And if you need to get up and leave for a minute, I totally understand. But I'm going to share trauma stories with you because they matter, and I think it puts context. So I get this call, and the call is, can you go to the hospital right now? So-and-so was shot up underneath the rib cage into some vital organs, and he's going into surgery. And I'm like, tell me more. Well, he lives with Dad and Mom. Dad woke up, domestic violence home, shoots Mom, shoots the dog, goes into the other room where this 20-something-year-old boy is, and he's got a girlfriend, so they're in bed together, and he shoots him, but he's laying down, so the bullet goes up underneath the rib cage and into some vital organs. Brother comes in, because now he's caught on what's going on, takes the gun from Dad, beats the snot out of Dad, goes and sits in the front yard, has a meltdown while he's waiting for EMS, and then Dad goes and gets another gun and shoots and kills himself. So now here I am, called to the hospital as the chaplain, and I trained in the hospital with CISM in the hospital. So I walk in, and honest to goodness, it was the Hatfield and the McCoys. Here's a hallway, and they got one side of the family, about 40 members on this side, and the other side, about 40 members on this side, and they had SWAT and Clark County Sheriff and the local police department there between them. All of the hospital chaplains at that time, there were about 4 or 5 of them were there, and they were just trying to keep the peace. And I showed up with one other chaplain and said, hey, we've been here, the person in surgery is one of ours. And the sweet lady who ran the program, she took her keys, threw them to me, and said, those 2 rooms are yours, my team, out of here. And walked away. And gave us rooms and said, you take care of it. If you need, you call me. And so we stood there for about 4 hours until people started talking to us. And then literally nobody talked to us. They were just glaring. And when they started talking, I had a man who was dying. He was terminal. He said, I have probably 2 to 3 months left. I don't know a pastor. Would you bury me? And these are the kind of conversations we just started having up and down the hall. And I'm not a hospital chaplain, but these are the kind of experiences that I think we can walk into. So again, do we step into these places in crisis and conflict resolution? And I'll tell you what did conflict resolution. A little division, and a lot of love. A little physical division between the 2 of them, and a lot of love. And pretty soon, law enforcement left, and it was me and one other chaplain and these families, and we helped them set up some meetings depending on who should be with who and who shouldn't. We helped create some waiting areas for different groups to go sit into, and conflict resolution was a big piece of that. But how many chaplains do that and know how to work that out? You do. who can you help? And I think that's big. How to have crisis conversations with individuals and groups. It's another thing that I think a lot of times when we look inside of our churches or even inside of our chaplaincy programs, and I'll be very honest about this, I'm a certified trainer through ICISF or International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and I teach the course on how to have one-on-one crisis conversations and group crisis conversations, grief following trauma, advanced group, a couple different groups like those. And what I realize is I train a lot of people in those two basic ones, the one-on-one crisis conversations and the group conversations. Most people need the certificate from some organization in psychological first aid. But this is just one organization, it's the largest of them. And most people have no idea how to do those interventions after they get the certificate, nor do they go out and do them. They do a lot of ministry of presence and other things, but they actually don't go out and do the interventions, and the interventions work. I use them in theaters of war. I use them with children who have been ritualistically molested and beaten. I have used them with people who have had a loved one die in a car accident. They work, and they work wonderfully. And so I'd say that's another piece is, do you actually know how to use those two tools, group crisis conversations and individual crisis conversations? Because if you do, the next question I would ask is, do you use them? Do you put them in play? So this last year, what I've realized is I trained a lot of law enforcement agencies, and now they're starting to call back and say, can you tell us how to use the things that we learned how to do? And I've been going and teaching them how to build their team and how to establish team meetings and what should be in the team meetings, how to establish role plays, and I'll hand them like 20 scenarios and say, you got the next 20 months covered, here's your meeting notes, get together and do it, and then we'll run through and do mock team plays and stuff like that so that they are working together and figuring out how to utilize the tools they have. You have the tools, do you use them and know how to use them? And then things that I'd see in there also are like assisting in long-term grief care. And if you've never heard of the class Grief Following Trauma, I'm going to tell you, I love it. I have taken a lot of grief training. I really appreciate this one. I just think it's a simple 2-day training that packs so much in there about how to help people through the longer process of grief, not just the trauma part. So with all that, I said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create our own team, and we're going to create our own chaplains, but it's not going to be a 2-day or a 1-week program. It's going to be a year. If you want in it, you got to do an interview, you have to have a background check. You've got to have 2 references from pastors or the ministry leaders in your church, and you got to get through the program and then do 60 hours of mentorship with another person. And there was pushback from our church, to be very honest about it, from the leadership in the church. They said, we don't want to give anybody that much authority. I said, great, well, who's going to do all the work? And when I send a care team person to a church or to a hospital, or I send a chaplain from the church that's recognized by the church, is commissioned before the church, it's a complete different feel from the people receiving it. It shouldn't be. I will acknowledge that, but it is, and I will acknowledge that. And so we started training chaplains, and within about 4 years, we had 30 chaplains in a church of 3,000, and we had 1 chaplain originally assigned to each pastor. So on every Sunday and every Wednesday, the chaplain would travel with the pastor. And somebody would come up and say, hey, this difficulty has happened, and the pastor would say, hey, you know what, thank you, let me pray with you, and then I'm going to hand you off to so-and-so. And then it came down to the point where there would be about 3 chaplains per pastor. And I planted a church. My church is about 120 people. I have, I'm going to say right now, I think it's like 14 chaplains. There are times when I can't call anybody because they're all busy. They've all got somebody. And 120, you know why? Because those 120 are a bridge to the candlestick maker. They're a bridge to the family and the friends and the foes. I mean, they're the bridge. And there are times when all those chaplains are busy, and we're like, wow, who's going to care for this person? Well, I have another team, which is great, where I get to draw from other resources. But I will tell you that if this is the evangelism of the 21st century, and it is, then hopefully I'm stimulating some thought in your head about how you get people into that field, how you get into that field, how you use the skills you have now to either reach into other places to equip them, or you go yourself. And I hope you'll hear that. I would even say, go back to your churches and say, I would like to be an extension of pastoral care in this church. And that's really what we modeled, was we were going to need an extension of pastoral care, so I wouldn't just have to put out the hottest fires. We could actually love people in trauma. So we decided in the church that if somebody lost somebody, for 1 year, I would assign a chaplain to them. And that chaplain then, using the models that we get from grief, following trauma, and others, would set up meetings with them throughout that entire year. Walk through the whole process, all the way through the anniversary of the loss of that person, and then obviously by that time there's a connection. They're going to continue to connect. But they would walk with that person for an entire year. They would first be their chaplain. If I was called even as the pastor, I would take that chaplain with me. They would go when the death notification or after the death notification had occurred. We'd walk through the memorial, and then they would start meeting with that person to calendar. And about a month and a half to 2 months after the person has lost their person, we have them sit down and say, let's just calendar the next year, and let's look at these significant dates that are ahead of you. And then we start planning them and planning meetings a week in advance to help them process and prepare to do the things they need. And then afterwards, to unpack how it went. What went well, what didn't go well, what do we need to do for the next one? And then we would help them figure out what they were going to do on the anniversary and how to do some of the grieving a few days before, so that it didn't become a dark, gloomy cloud, but a day that you could celebrate and remember the person, even if there was some hardship and some tears involved in that too. So again, hopefully I'm stimulating some stuff in you. Maybe you do everything that I'm talking about and you do it quite a bit better, and that's cool. I really hope you do. But I hope I'm stimulating some of the thinking here. So we created this, and here's the other part that's really important, at a monthly meeting. A monthly meeting. So most law enforcement agencies that I have difficulties with, and I don't mean personal difficulties with, what I mean by that, because that wasn't said quite well, who have difficulties utilizing the team that they have trained, is they don't do any kind of regular meetings. I had one law enforcement agency said, hey, could you come talk to us? It's our annual meeting. I'm like, oh, you do like a big conference? No, the team gets together once a year. And I'm like, well, how does that work for you? And I love the answer. He said, well, not at all. It doesn't work at all. Our team's terrible. That's why we're asking you to come. And I'm like, okay, so I'm going to come, but I'm going to come, and you need to know that what I'm going to tell you is that you're going to have to find creative solutions about how to get your team together, even if in fragmented team sections, because of one shift and another shift. And I will write the scenarios for you for more than a year. I will actually put the team meetings together, and then I'm going to run you through a mock team meeting. We're going to do a 2-hour team meeting. So you got to give me 4 hours. 2 hours to train and 2 hours to do a team meeting. And then I'm going to give you all the scenarios, and now you got to meet monthly. If you're into that, I'm coming. If you're not, I'm not. And so I've been meeting with law enforcement agencies like this, and what I'm realizing is that they have so many skills, but they don't have regular trainings. So that's another piece of it. Where do you go? What's interesting to me is if you go into some of these smaller communities, you can find that your police chief is also your medical examiner and maybe the county treasurer. So it just depends. And so sometimes I'll go into the rural areas. I got to do a conference like this for the Washington Association of Medical Examiners. They're truncated is whack me. And they've capitalized on this, by the way. They have shirts with buzzards on them and stuff, and they say, before anything can happen, we're there. Yeah. So I spoke with them also, and the same situation exists. Lots of training, lots of skill. But a lot of those who were working as medical examiners or chaplains in the community said, we have nobody else. Where else am I supposed to get a team? And so then we'd spend a lot of time just talking about constructive team creation. And that could be that, a lot of times they would have a 911 chaplain. They would have a medical examiner who did a lot of death notifications and trauma work, and they would have somebody in the hospital who did those things. I'd say, you have a team. What you have is walls instead of bridges. So let's create bridges. And we'd help them come back together and develop teams, because you can't do this alone and be okay. You can't. There's just sometimes you gotta get that stuff out so it doesn't get you. So within 3 years, we originally started this just to create chaplains in churches, and we've trained a lot of churches now who have chaplaincy programs. The program I told you about where the youth pastor and the 10-year-old got washed in the Columbia River and drowned, one of the ladies who was there and whose son was there, she has since gone through the training program, and she joined our team, she served on our team, and then she went back to the church and said, "You need to hire me to be the care team director in this church because we don't have one and we need one." And they said yes. And she's currently training 30 people inside of her church to be their care team, and they have ordained her as a chaplain inside of the church. And she does care inside of the church. So hopefully what we're going to see is more expanding of care inside of the church, chaplains serving in their church bodies. But what we found is all of a sudden people who went through the program to be part of the church, we had a guy named Leo. And Leo's a neat guy, no training in trauma work at all, but he was in the military before. And he went through the whole program, and like 6 months later, he had been hired by 2 police departments and 1 fire agency in his community to be their chaplain. He quit his job, started a full-time chaplaincy agency, and has jumped in and is working and is still coming to our RCISM team meetings to have a team because he doesn't have one. So all of a sudden, we've seen chaplains everywhere. In the county I'm in, county sheriff's department's never had a chaplain. And one of the chaplains that went through our program, she just said, "Hey, I want to start doing ride-alongs. I've been in the Coast Guard before. I'm a dental hygienist. I'd really love to be involved." And they said, "Yeah, ride along, ride along, ride along." About 3 months ago, they ordained her or commissioned her as the first chaplain in the sheriff's department in the sheriff's history. And she just got to share a story with me where she was riding with one of the deputies, and the deputy was telling her some sordid stuff in life and said, "You know what? Every time I ride with you, I feel so good. I need what you have." And she got to pray with her to lead her to Jesus. And she ended up at our church like 2 weeks ago. There with her Bible in her hand, just sitting next to our chaplain. Just amazing, good stuff. And so what we saw is the program that we created just keeps moving out. We have EMS and other people who go back, but we really want to see people going back and serving in their churches. And I would say, you're a chaplain. Does your church know that you're a chaplain, and have you offered your services as an extension of pastoral care in crisis? You get to draw the boundaries. You can say, "I'll do death notifications," or "I'll do death notifications and help people through the grieving process." We've had a lot of our chaplains go back and join groups like Grief Share and run them. And what we found is they're so qualified. So the Grief Share program is a decent program, but they bring tools into that program that the program doesn't give you. And so they're doing great. They go into Celebrate Recoveries, they go into different places, and they bring a whole host of tools that you don't get somewhere else. So you have the tools. Where else might you want to use those? And I would say get creative. So what we realize is we serve a lot of law enforcement community. It just seems to be a niche for us. And what I've learned with every group of people is they like to eat, right? And so we know this lady, maybe you've heard of her or not, the Soup Ladies, Mama Pesarelli. She lived in Buckley, Washington. It's COVID, moved to Idaho. But she owned a restaurant and she was a police chaplain. And what she realized is they just need to eat. And so she created a group called the Soup Ladies, and they have their FEMA certifications through the Incident Command System and the National Incident Management System. And they have done their work so that they can actually be covered by FEMA when they go to disasters. Are covered. That's why law enforcement doesn't deal with so many groups of people, because you don't have insurance that's adequate. So if something happens, you're going to sue them instead of your agency because they have way more money, deeper pockets, right? So what you learned is if you get your certification through FEMA, you join your state's emergency management team with a background check and your FEMA certifications, all of a sudden FEMA covers you, right? So law enforcement will let you come to the scene. Matter of fact, they ask you to be a part of 911 dispatch so that they can call you to feed them. And so we said, "Hey, Ginger, can I come hang out with you?" My wife and I drove up to Buckley. We spent a few days. And we went on a training with an FBI and local police hostage negotiation training, and we fed them. Boy, and they come over and talk to you, and they love soup, and then when they're on break, somebody comes over and says, "Yeah, the divorce I'm going through is really messing with my head right now." And they know who we are. They know that they're coming to talk to Jesus people. And we feed them, and while they're eating, we counsel them, we love on them, we offer to meet with them. And so we started going through the process of what it looks like. So we talked to our local law enforcement, said, we'd love to feed you. They said, really? Huh. I said, what are your needs? They said, a bathroom. I said, wait a minute, I was feeding you. And they said, no, we go out on some of these, evidence recoveries or large-scale events where we're going to be there 7-8 hours, and often you can't use the facilities in the house. When search and rescue from the sheriff's department's going out looking for a body, sometimes it's on along the side of the highway, and they're like, people really frown upon us going bathroom in the field along the highway. But we can't leave. Could you provide us a bathroom? So instead of just getting a mobile kitchen, what we did was we bought a toy hauler and we converted it into a mobile kitchen. I mean, we gutted it. We tore out the couches and the tables and the bed and all that stuff. And so the tailgate can go down. We can roll out carts with chairs and barbecues and griddles and coffee pots, and we pop up awnings and we set out tables and put up lighting. We're often the incident command center at an event. So because they all come out there and they're huddled over the hood of their car with maps, and we're like, hey, why don't you come on over here? I'll get you a cup of coffee. You can sit at the table. Hey, you can turn on that light if you want. Oh yeah, it's dry. We have pop-up shelters everywhere. And we're making soup. It'll be ready in 30 minutes, but in the meantime, if you'd like some snacks, there's a bunch of stuff on the counter over here. Oh, we even have hot chocolate, and sometimes they're so funny. They're like hot chocolate like little kids. And they're all huddled around the griddle. We're at the scene at 17 degrees outside, and the wind chill factor is just killing stuff. I mean, it's cold. One of them spilled the coffee, it froze on the table the minute it hit. We had to use a knife scraper. They're all huddled around the grill with their little hot chocolate and marshmallows, like little kids. And so that's how we realized that we would have this door. And so we opened this door, and we got creative, so where they wouldn't talk with the chaplains before, now they call us out. Would you come? Would you make grilled cheese sandwiches? They're like little kids. We make grilled cheese sandwiches, and they just love it. So I would say, think about that. We had a fire response up the gorge last fall, and the fire, I think it was September, it was moving really fast, and there were fire teams coming from everywhere. And normally, Oregon Department of Wildland Fire, or whatever, one of those groups, they send a mobile kitchen. And their mobile kitchen is like 3 semis, an ice truck makes its own ice. And I'm gonna say there were about 35 personnel to feed all the fire guys at the camp. Well, they couldn't get them there, but they needed fire guys right then. So they called our team through 911 dispatch and said, hey, could you and the chaplains bring your trailer up? And normally we serve like 15 to 30, 35 people. There's how many people? 240. Sure, we'll do it. And with 5 people, we fed, and one travel trailer, with a flop down gate, we fed 240 people. And it was awesome. It was like camping and serving at the same time. It was wonderful. And so I would just encourage you to think too, you have a lot of skills. Some doors have been closed. How can you open other doors? And I will tell you, food is your friend. Food opens doors. And I realize I'm like way behind now on this course, so let me just go a little faster here. That's one of the things we did. I would ask you, how would you do that? And a lot of the training in the law enforcement community, we're trying to figure out how to support their spouses and their families. Because we realize, if you don't know this, in the law enforcement community, domestic violence rates are as high as 40%. You got a lot of people who are carrying a lot of trauma, and that what they see in the world is the ugly every single day. Every day, that's what they see. Most of their calls are not a one-time call, they're what they call repeat customers. It's the place that they go to over and over and over and over and over and over. It's going to be part of their route. They know their route, they know the frequent flyers, they're going to stop and they're going to see that same group of people. And often the law doesn't stop things that we would count as heartbreaking and atrocious. And so we go in and we say, hey, when difficult things happen, we want to actually create programs for your spouses. So we go in and we, like police action leagues or different groups like that, or spouses of law enforcement officers, we train them how to do trauma intervention and to meet the other side of the equation. Because often we deal with the officers or firefighters, whoever, but we don't deal with their spouses. Now I would throw that back in the hospital setting. I don't know who your primary target is. I don't know if it's the patient. Some of you, that's true. I don't know if it's the providers, the doctors, the nurses, the people who do the work. I don't know if it's in a care facility where it's mainly families and patients or staff. But what I'll say is that even in basic marketing, right? It's easier to give more services to an existing customer than to create new customers. Okay? Your customer could be that doctor you're standing in front of, or that ED department nurse, or the neonatal worker. Are they married? Do they have kids? What's happening with all that trauma that's going on? How do you support those other groups of people? Your reach is limited to your imagination. Because I'm going to tell you that there's bridges out. There's bridges out of the place that you work. And I'm going to ask you to consider, do you want to walk down some of those bridges? Or train more people to join you so that they can walk down the bridges while you care for the primaries? And that's what I realized is I had to work my way out of a job. I had to. If I was really going to do any good at this at all, I had to replace myself. I had to work my way out of a job. And what I see is like Carrie, who's now Clark County Sheriff's chaplain. I worked my way out of a job. They don't call me anymore. Carrie does it. Miranda, who's over there at the other church. I worked my way out of a job. They're not going to call me again. She does it. The other church, I got Chuck. I've got a few different guys out there, and they're not going to call me anymore because they've trained somebody else to do it, which means I can go to other places that haven't been opened up yet. I get to go knock on the door and pull back a doomed door. Replace yourself. Expand yourself. Bring other people along. Isn't that what we see throughout the Bible? I mean, if there was somebody who was doing ministry because they were called, didn't they have a disciple? Why would that be different in chaplaincy? Why would that be different in our groups? We have a travel trauma team, and one of the people on my travel trauma team does not want to be a chaplain, does not want to talk about mud, blood, and gore, but he was a logistics officer in the Army. And I said, great. Can you figure out where the water and food's coming from, how we're going to get transportation, who's going to buy the airfare? And he's like, oh man, I love it, but do not talk to me about that. Sold. Replace yourself so that you can expand, that you can keep opening doors for more people to walk into and do those parts. So just be creative is what I would say. And our CISM team responds to the local school district. So the school districts in our county have what's called a SMART team, and it was originally intended for the districts to come together and say, okay, we've got some people who have childhood education, right? And then we have counselors and we have school psychologists and we have other things. Let's create a team that when a trauma happens, we can bring the team in. They're specialized, they're trained to deal with trauma in the school. And so they do. So a student suicides or dies or a teacher dies or something complicated goes on. We've done one school shooting in all the time that we've done this. And we've done a knife attack. We've done all kinds of different stuff. But what we realized is, wait, they're doing that. Why don't we ask them if we can join them? So we went to the lead of the SMART team and said, hey, we have a bunch of chaplains and trauma people here, and I want you to know that we are not coming in to evangelize. If there is a person of faith in your group that needs somebody to talk to, they could certainly talk to us. But we know trauma. We'd love to come help, and we specialize in kids. And they're like, well, let's see. So they let about 2 or 3 of us on the team. Every call that goes out to a school, they ask us to send chaplains down. Everyone. The school shooting, when it happened, they said, this is over our head. Could your team lead it? Your chaplains lead this response? And then what we will do is give you our team, and you can tell them whatever you want them to do. So another place, we just said, hey, it's already existing. I think we've got skills. You've got a program, but we have a ton of tools that you just don't, because we're strange people. We think about death, dying, murder, rape, suicide, and killing. Could we come in and join you? And it was a slow bridge, but now it's a wide open bridge. It's a 5-lane bridge with lights and welcome signs and everything else. And so I just say, expand your thinking. Where can you take what you have and continue to add it into other programs that don't exist or do exist? So I want to really quickly now, I want to divert, and I want you to think about this. I want you to think about chaplaincy in 3 ways. And I realize this is a very incomplete model, but it's a good starting point of the conversation. That model is on your page 2, and it's in the center, it's kind of a graph. And what I want you to see is when you think about chaplaincy, don't just think about the way you do chaplaincy currently. I would say break it up into 3 different groups of chaplains who are out there, or trauma teams too. This also works the same way. The first group I call 911 dispatch chaplains, and it's the one that, law enforcement's going to say, hey, we're at a scene, this terrible, awful thing happened, can you come? And I enjoyed that kind of chaplaincy for a period of time. It was thrilling, but it's in the first 24 hours, so you're going to get called when it happens, and you're going to go to the scene. You're probably going to have a one-time contact. There are exceptions to every one of the rules that I'm going to say. Some of those you're going to have more contacts, but frequently as a 911 chaplain, especially in a bigger area that has more coverage, more citizens, it's going to be a one-time contact. There will be exceptions to that. And often it's to do 2 things, ministry of presence and to give death notifications. That's really the 911 chaplain, that's the bread and butter of what they do, right? They get called, hey, can you be dispatched to the scene? Yeah, how soon can you get there? I can be there in 15 minutes. Great, we'll see you on the scene. Who's doing the death notification? You are. Okay, I am. Who's going to put them back together? Okay, you are. I am. We do the death notification. We do ministry of presence. We sit with them until they get connected with their loved ones. So it's going to be multiple interventions typically. It should be at least. And this is where CISM teams fail frequently. They do one and then they don't meet again, which is a missed opportunity. So multiple visits to the same people and to different groups of them, divided up in different ways, and using multiple interventions, one-on-one conversations, informational conversations to groups of people, or interactive conversations in a group of people. And that's the one I like the most. For me, I really enjoyed this type of chaplaincy. This is me, right? The other one is I call them afterwards, just because I'm not more creative than that. So if you come up with another creative name, feel free to share it with me and I'll change my chart. And often, there are people who more are embedded in a department or an agency, a hospital, a nursing home, things of that nature, where you're going to have the repeat customer, maybe for longer periods of time. Even dealing with different stages in life. After a difficult injury or illness has occurred and the trauma, but then through the grief part and reconstructing, back to Ecclesiastes 3, there's a season and a change of life and helping people in seasons, and then moving down the road to doing a memorial, and then moving past that to helping people with grief. I mean, you have a bigger window in a longer period of time. There's more, I would call biblical counseling that takes place in that area. There's a deeper relationship that will probably form. So what I want you to think about is, that could be church, it could be a care facility, hospital, or any of those, but I want you to ask yourself, which of those more describes you? And when you think about that, I want you to think about that in really practical terms too. What will work well for you? If you do not like dealing with blood and bodies and mutilation, defecation, crime scenes some of the houses I've walked into, like, you probably do this already, but I carry a little thing of Vicks Vapor Rub. And if that body's been in there for a few days, and sometimes the house smells worse than a dead body anyway, I put some Vicks Vapor Rub in the corner of my nose. It's the only way I can deal with it. And it's awesome because I walk in there and you actually test it, and you're like, yeah, this works. So you just might say, hey, you know what? I can handle that. That doesn't bother me at all. I could be a 911 chaplain. But if you say, I remember last year when I cut my hand and I passed out when I saw myself bleeding, don't be a 911 chaplain. This is a bad idea. This is a really bad plan, right? But we have people who come into the program and they say, I can't be a chaplain because I can't see dead bodies. Well, you can be a chaplain. You could totally be a chaplain. Just don't be a 911 chaplain. Why don't you be a CISM team member? And what are the downfalls of that one? Well, the trauma chaplain's going to see the CISM team chaplain, or the person who's doing psychological first aid, is going to hear. And they're going to hear it repeatedly. And they're going to get to all the depths of the story, all the minutiae that the the 911 chaplain might not ever hear. Hopefully they don't hear all that. It would be too much. By the way, a little nuance. Did you know they're trying to get 911 centers to start using video 911? which means that they would have them turn on the camera so that they could see the scene and walk through it and help them with first aid or survive a brutal attack. And I'm like, it's going to be the shortest career in trauma history. There's no way they can survive it. That much visual and informational pieces of trauma is 6 months. They're going to make it 6 months. 911 chaplains all over the country are saying, we don't want it, we don't want it, we don't want it. And as I train a lot of 911, not chaplains, 911 workers, and many of them say, the day that happens is the day I quit. So just think about that. So, are you more of a relation person? Like you don't just want to meet them once or twice. You want to be invested in their life. You want to be there. Well, then you're probably in that afterward group. Maybe you're saying, hey, I'm already in one of these groups and I'd like to diversify and pick up a little bit of the other one. Well, think about it in these terms. I would say it will really help you determine which doors you should open and not open. And it will help you as you mentor and train other people to let them start saying, hey, if hearing about the story is really powerful for you and you can manage that, that'd be great. But if hearing is knocking you out, then wait till you get to the sights and the smells. I don't know that you can do this. Or, oh, hey, you're really equipped for that. This would be a good venue. So hopefully you can use that model. I've helped a lot of people who didn't think they could be a chaplain because they had a misunderstanding that everybody had to go see bodies. And, or others say, oh, I can't do long-term counseling. I don't want to do that. I don't want to meet with people 6, 7, 8 times. Okay, well, here's a chaplaincy that would probably fit best for you. Let's do that, okay? So here's a question for you, and there's no way I'm going to get through this course, but I think I've covered everything anyway, other than this. I'm going to give you this part. If you wanted to expand your field of services, which of these are you more drawn to, and which ones might you avoid? From all the things we were just talking about, are these 3 fields of chaplaincy. Are they similar to what you are already doing, or would this stretch you? You know, you said, hey, right now I'm HCMA, I'm doing this is the part I serve, but boy, I like feeding people. I can take some courses and start, or hey, I would love to join the school trauma response team, or I'd really like to expand some care inside of our church. What are the parts, and would this stretch you, and what holds you from going down that road? So I'm going to give you just 5 minutes because I need to close out and I'll need 5 minutes to do that. So when I break you, I'll have to break quickly so I can let you out on time. Take 5 minutes, go back to your groups and just discuss that, and then we'll close out here as I figure out how to expedite. I want to talk about now. So hopefully, and again, the goal, can I get everybody's attention? It would be so great. Can I get everybody? Okay. Hopefully, and the goal of this was to say, hey, some doors have closed, some doors can be opened. And I'm hoping to stimulate some thought in you, and then we're going to come back and we're going to deal with suicidology, we're going to deal with helping children in trauma and grief, and then we're going to deal with strategic planning. How do you utilize the services that you have with more people to make sure that you're using those bridges out of the one-person contact to multiple-person contact? So we're going to go through those parts in the next 3 sessions, but what I'm really hoping is that maybe we got some thoughts going, maybe that we're already going and just expanded some places to take those. And so now the next question comes, and this is a question even for your organization, something for you to think about. You have a core curriculum of training, and I don't think you should ever walk away from your core curriculum. The core curriculum should be the core curriculum. What I would say is maybe consider expanding pathways. And that's what we've done in our chaplaincy. We started out with a core curriculum. You don't have that, you don't have anything, you can't be a chaplain with us. You can take the CISM training or psychological first aid and be a part of our team without being a chaplain. But you can't be a chaplain without being, have gone through our whole core program and done your mentorship. But now that some of these doors that we're talking about are beginning to open or have the possibility of opening, I was talking with one sweet lady today who got in that door when the Soviet Union dropped the curtain and Russia came back and said, hey, we've got a time where we need some people to come in. Church, come in and teach us ethics and morals. And there was a door that opened for the church to go in. Right, into Russia. And for 10 years, we were talking about that this morning, you could walk in there and they'd put you right in the school system and you could crack the Bible and communist Russia at the time and talk about Jesus Christ. And I would say, here's the door. There's a door and it's open. And some of those doors we might have to push on a little bit, some of them we might have to dismantle some of the wall and build a bridge to get to the door. But I want to ask you, can you consider what it would be like to have another pathway in your chaplaincy? Here's your main training, but we really want to do this. What would it look like to add pathways? Pathways that would say, we'd also like to be able to reach the first responder chaplains. Maybe you say, I don't want to be a first responder chaplain. But boy, oh boy, that's a tough job. I can't imagine some of the garbage that they see. Maybe we could reach out to the first responder chaplains and say, hey, we would love to host a meeting for you guys. We'll provide the meal, you come in, and we could actually do some of the stuff to help you unpack some of the garbage that you're packing around. We had the Oso mudslides in Washington several years back, and it was up in northern Washington, and it buried people and their homes and their pets and their children. And out of that, several of the chaplains who responded, because it was a long response, it was the end of their chaplaincy career. It was just too much. I mean, you had logging crews out there with tracos and stuff, because there was so much mud. And they had the equipment, and so they were digging for people with tracos, and just do the math in your head how that turned out. And so the difficulty of finding people and the way that you found them, and they just retired. So I want you to think about pathways. I just want to open that door for you, and then I want to come back and say, in order to get to some of those parts, what walls do you need to dismantle, or at least bring down that you could talk over the top of it, and what bridges might you need to create? One thing in our program that I take a lot of joy in is we've created a lot of bridges. So there was a bad chaplain experience with a hospital in our area like 30 years ago. And the hospital chaplains at that point said, that's it, first responder chaplains not allowed past the door. So you had to take off your credentials, everything. It was a bad experience. And they were right to respond, but the response was kind of an over response. And it took a lot of time in the hospitals now. And I get called by hospitals now as a first responder chaplain. And they'll say, hey, this is what we did. What do you think about this response? That's great. Have you considered this? Oh, wow, that was awesome. How are you guys doing? And then they start to call us and say, hey, there's some situations where somebody comes into the door and immediately we have to pronounce them, or, a sudden baby death. And they turn around and they begin to walk out the door. And once they walk out the door, it's on our territory. Could we call your team? Would your team meet them out the door? We're like, yeah. But I've had some bad experiences too. We had, again, this is one of those stories on suicide. If you're not comfortable with it, I do invite you to walk out. We had a call where a teen boy, senior, just graduated high school, on Snapchat, shot himself in the head for all his friends to see. Crazy stuff. We see that kind of stuff all the time, unfortunately. Well, we show up to the scene. We're called by law enforcement. We're there. We're responding. We're dealing with the kids who were there. And we realized, we were scratching our head all of a sudden. We were realizing, wait a minute. How are these kids all here? Because as I'm talking to them, they live 20, 30 minutes away, and they were here in 3 to 5 minutes. They were there before the parents returned. The siblings were home, but the parents weren't. And we started talking to them more and more and more and more. And I'm like, have you guys ever lost anybody else by suicide? Yeah, one of our other friends shot himself in the head on Snapchat 3 months ago. I'm like, this is looking a little bit more suspicious. This is looking like a pattern. So I talked to the law enforcement officer who's there investigating. I said, hey, do I have your permission to reach out to the schools and talk to the schools? All these kids are in the same school. And I need some history, and most of them are going back to school, and we need to get a bridge to care. The law enforcement said, oh, please do. And I said, oh, no problem. I'm part of the SMART team. I respond with the school. So I called the school, the head of that district for the team, and they said, absolutely not. We don't talk to anybody else. We don't share with other people. What we do with these kids is private. Nobody else is involved. And so I called the superintendent. And I found my way around, made some connections, called the superintendent, said, I just want to let you know what's happening here. And so territory is more important than life. Law enforcement, who holds a pretty high responsibility, is willing to create a bridge, but you're not. I just want to drop that on you and let that alone. And it created a lot of ruffles. It created some difficulty with me and the person who led that team, who no longer does. But I think we have to do that and do it tactfully. It's our job to make the bridges. Your bridge builders are wall builders. It's one of the two. It's up to you to decide how you're gonna do that. So here's some pathways, here's some ways to consider, here's some bridges, here's some walls that might need to come down, and I would just challenge you to consider that. So, with that, my time is up. I hope this has been helpful for you. I really appreciate the time with you, and if you all don't show